My name is Jim Doty. I've met many of you. I'm the director of the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education here at Stanford within the School of Medicine and the Neuroscience Institute. And for those of you who have been involved with this work, we have a number of ongoing events. One of those events is called the Mingwu Lecture, which is usually every quarter. Another event is more of a science for scientists type of event, which is not as appealing to as many people, so those numbers are a little bit smaller. But in the conversations with people who've attended these, it seemed as though that it might be interesting, instead of having a formal lecture, to have a conversation with people who, by their actions, have had an impact on the world, and those actions are characterized by their compassion towards others and their interest in betterment of the world. So you're at an interesting event. This is the first one of these we're having. I hope it's not the last, but these are conversations on compassion. And our inaugural guest is Jon Kabat-Zinn, who I think for everyone in this room does not need an introduction. But for others who might ultimately see this on the web or on our website, I'll just give a brief introduction. And I know I don't want to embarrass you, but I'll
turn away.
Jon got his PhD actually in molecular biology at MIT, and I hate to say the date, 1971.
No.
I did say the date. But he's had an interest in Zen practice and was the co-founder of the Cambridge Zen Center. Was that in 73?
Something like that. 72.
72. And then went off, and actually I think many people agree that he has been the dominant force and the driving force to bring mindfulness practice to the West. And it has been extraordinarily successful. I think Full Catastrophe Living had a huge impact. That I think came out in 90 or 91, followed by Wherever You Are.
Wherever you go,
there you are.
Yeah. Or you could call it, whatever you think it is, that's what it is.
And his impact on the world ever increases. He was the founding director of the Mindfulness in Medicine, Healthcare, and Society Center at the University of Massachusetts, and also the Stress Reduction Clinic. There have now been a large number of articles demonstrating the value of mindfulness in regard to a number of areas, particularly stress and pain. So it's really my pleasure to start this conversation. And one of the places I think, and oftentimes when you hear these talks, they're really directed, let's say as an example, about mindfulness practice. But one of the things that always interests me is, and maybe you can comment on this, is there's always a backstory to how someone gets an interest in a particular area or what ultimately is their passion or drives them. And maybe for us, you can give us that backstory.
Well, first of all, thank you, Jim, and pleasure to be here, and pleasure to be here with all of you. And as a rule, I don't like to give backstory. I'll make an exception in this case, and I do every once in a while. But the reason I don't, yes, please come in, welcome, is because there's an inevitable way, you all know in this society, to sort of turn the spotlight on particular people, generate a story. The story is inevitably only partially true if it's true at all, and then differentiate them from yourself. And my work is all about actually recognizing the commonality in us all. And so not that we're identical, but that we have sort of an identical repertoire of possibilities to work from, and those are shaped by our DNA and our environment and everything about us. So my hesitation is always around then creating some kind of reified story that then has to go with me everywhere I go, and people ask me about it and everything, and they make me invariably the subject, whereas this is really about what we call neuroscience first-person experience, so you're the subject, okay? And you're also not an object, but you can actually flip that subject-object dualism and actually be, or realize, I was going to say become, but it's already true that you are, the experience, the field of experience itself in unfolding moment by moment. And then, yeah, of course there's going to be a narrative, and there are all sorts of pathways in the brain that many of you know a lot better than I do that are actually related and are being shown to be related to the narrative construction of a sort of self-story that are located in the sort of midline regions of the cerebral cortex. And in MBSR training, which we'll come to in a minute, it turns out that that can be uncoupled from other regions of the brain where it's no story, it's just the present moment. So isn't that interesting? That like we have all of these different repertoires within our, the sort of full spectrum of who we are as a human being. And yet we can fall into certain kind of patterns of self-identification that actually make the story even a lot less interesting. So having said that disclaimer.
I was going to say we lost the story. See, he was quite good at that. He was already...
I've asked myself that question as well, because the trouble is, as you get older, you get more and more projections put onto you. I don't know how many of you have experienced that yourself, but it's almost inevitable. At least you'll get the projection, look how old he is, it's like, and it's inevitable. I mean, that sort of, and especially if you're known for something that you were involved in or that you participated in, getting tons of projections, and also like all sorts of sub-stories about what possible relationships we could all have and what great work we could do together or whatever it is. But my sort of, so I've always sort of pondered in a certain way, well, how did this really come about? And is there a way to tell it that's actually true to my own experience? And I think the answer is no. Which is why I don't like to tell the story, because depending on who the audience is, I could shape it this way, I could shape it that way, and I'm aware enough of my own mind and sort of socialized motivations to realize, like, you show a different kind of profile, if you will, depending on what the situation is, or even, like, I didn't even know how to dress for this group. I sort of totally overdressed, It's like, I dress the way you dress, but, I thought, well, Stanford, I don't know how he's going to dress, and all that kind of stuff. And what does it, and what does it matter? See, what does it matter? But we can get terminally preoccupied with that kind of thing. So to make a sort of very long story of my life, which you don't need to know, short, I began to realize that maybe my love for the sort of, for lack of a better term, I'm going to use the word dharma in its most universal import, okay, of wisdom and compassion and clarity and heartfulness, that maybe that love actually, and interest in it, came from my early childhood watching my parents. Okay, my father was a kind of world-class scientist, full professor, endowed chair in 4 different departments at Columbia Medical School, and my mother was and very well known. Sort of one of his students won the Nobel Prize, and my mother was a completely unknown but totally prolific painter who was still alive and is 97 and a half years old, and had her first art show with a group of fellow painters when she was 90 years old. So, sort of like you get the one science and the arts, okay? And I grew up in that kind of household that C.P. Snow was writing about in the 50s, like called the two cultures. And this is all in reflection, by the way. It wasn't something I knew that. But what I did know was that they have and I knew this very early, my parents have totally different ways of understanding the world. And it got me really interested in, well, what is the world like if it's not exactly the way my father sees it, not exactly the way my mother sees it? How might it be possible to actually know the world inwardly and outwardly, because it was obvious that in a certain way they didn't know themselves all that much. I mean, I won't say any more because television cameras are rolling, but you know, it's like relationships between men and women. I mean, what could be more complicated than that? Or between human beings, but who consider themselves family, whatever the gender. So at a certain point when I got exposed to the martial arts and yoga and meditation that were all kind of rolled up into one for me when I was, you know, young, in my early 20s, it became clear that actually mindfulness or awareness was in some way the final common pathway of different ways of knowing. That it was like the capacity that we already have for decoding, in some sense, seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, interoception, proprioception, all the various, you know, sort of sensory capacities that we have, that require what the Buddhists would call mind in order to actually give rise to the sort of end result, because you can see without seeing, you can hear without hearing, you can eat without tasting, you can touch without really being present for it. So there's a certain way in which you can zone along on autopilot your entire life. And it became very interesting to me once I got exposed to Zen meditation practice and all sorts of various streams of Buddhist practice and yoga and martial arts, that there was something here that was actually fundamental, that maybe it was a kind of final common pathway of what makes us human, is awareness. And it never, ever got any attention or airtime in my entire educational trajectory, not at MIT and nothing before MIT. I mean, no one wanted to talk about that, not even in what was called then neurophysiology. Just too complicated, consciousness, forget about it. Except for artificial intelligence, they were happy to talk about that. So I won't say any more about the story, except that those strains, I think in retrospect, kind of explained, one, why I love science, why I love the arts, why I love all sorts of different aspects of human generativity and imagination and creativity, but not simply for their own sake, but because they in some sense, are reflecting back to us about something of our own interior capacity and capacity for relationality that is potentially profoundly transformative and healing. And that was something that, because there's so much suffering in the world, that seemed to me to be really important and not something that should be kept entirely to the Buddhists, you know, or sequestered in some way. This was like important knowledge along the lines of like, you know, the laws of gravity or the laws of thermodynamics. This is important knowledge discovered by, you know, various researchers who, like the Buddha, for instance, and others who actually went very, very deeply into the nature of suffering, the nature of mind, and so forth, using their own methodologies because they didn't have, you know, CT scans and fMRI, you know, equipment and stuff like that, but came up with really valid, potentially valid frameworks and formulations that maybe we could now, with science being at the place where it's at, not validate, but at least explore as to their relevance for the kinds of issues that we face as a species, as individual human beings, as a nation, in this present age. So that's it. From now on, I'll answer more shortly.
No, that was pretty succinct. You know, this was sort of the end of the 60s, if you will, and at least for me, and I think maybe for a lot of people in this room, you know, in your late teens and early 20s, you don't know really a whole lot at all, and you certainly, but for most people, don't know a whole lot about themselves. But it seems as though you attached onto this fairly early and stuck with it. And what was the process itself, though? You said that what the realization was, that there was this body of knowledge which was available, and through your own analysis, sort of like the Buddha says, through your own analysis, you realized its import. But what drove you ultimately to feel that this was important to others, or drive you to bring this forward to others, or even believe that you had the ability to have an impact or want to have an impact?
It's a great question, and I'm not sure I can answer it completely, or that I'd want to, because there's a certain element of mystery to all of this that I don't want to actually completely eradicate. So the first answer, and I think the most honest, would be I don't know. Then there are an awful lot of details. As again, I said, you can tell the story 1,000 different ways and answer the question lots of different ways to recruit certain aspects of what you think might be important. So one of them was, to me, was I first heard the Dharma talked about explicitly at MIT, of all places, in 1966, when Houston Smith, who was a professor of philosophy and religion at MIT, happened to invite somebody who was named Philip Kapleau, who had not yet published the book, The Three Pillars of Zen, to give a talk at MIT in seminar hour, and which was like 4:30 in the afternoon. MIT is much bigger now, but still it was thousands and thousands of people in long pentagon-like corridors. And when I showed up in that, I saw a sign on the bulletin board, The Three Pillars of Zen, talk by Philip Kapleau at the invitation of Houston Smith. I didn't know what Zen was. I didn't know who Houston Smith was. I didn't know who Philip Kapleau was. I went to that talk. And there were only 4 people at MIT, aside from the speaker and the invitee and myself, who came to that talk. There were 5 people in the room. And his talk just literally blew the top off my head. I was 22 years old at the time. And it was like, oh, that's when the connection happened. Art, science, real life, consciousness, and something, and practice. That was the grounding thing. It's like, it's not a philosophy. It's a way of being that can actually be played with, experimented with. Okay, and where's the laboratory? Here. Sorry, forgot about the microphone. And so I just started practicing. And everything downstream from that has, in some sense, flowed out of the practice. So, my relationship to molecular biology was, I was going into molecular biology because I wanted to ultimately explore the nature of consciousness. And I thought, well, the way to do it is you do physics and chemistry and biology and then molecular biology, and then you go into they didn't call it neuroscience in those days, but like that kind of trajectory. And then when I heard that talk, I realized, wait a minute, there's a whole other avenue to this. I can just go through the door of direct experience. And since I could see that the science approach was going to take decades at least, this seemed like at least a good hedge on the bet, sort of like do it from the inside. It might actually change your life, and never mind about all the mechanisms that might be involved. So I began to think about work. And the way I thought about it was like, what would I, because at MIT and a lot of other places like Stanford, you're somehow being groomed to win the Nobel Prize or do something at least at that level. I mean, my thesis advisor was a Nobel laureate. And, it's like I was born into that kind of society, and it's like there's a certain gaining idea about it and a certain kind of way in which you construct your personality around how smart you are and how, imaginative you are in relationship to everybody else. Does anyone know what I'm talking about, or am I So, and I was suffering from that. I mean, I was really suffering from it. It felt like, it doesn't matter, how good you are, because it's like, that's the wrong frame to hold up, in some way. So I began to think about, what is my real job on the planet? What would I love so much? I'd pay to do it. That's what I want to do. I want a job that I would pay to do. I love it so much. And then I just meditated on that, using it almost like a koan for 10 years. What is my job on the planet? With a capital J. Not what I've been trained to do, but what do I love? And it wasn't obvious. But the more I was practicing, the more I was sitting retreats, the more I was going and hearing different teachers talk about their understanding and watch how they guided people into this stream, the more I began to realize, like, oh my God, this is like gold. I mean, this needs to be out there like in kindergarten. It needs to be everywhere. I mean, this is like, an instruction manual on how to be a human being in some sense, or at least how not to cut off parts of yourself and stuff them away for 20 or 30 years and then spend the rest of your life in therapy. So those were some of the elements that were involved in that. So that finally, on a meditation retreat, and I wrote about this, so that's why I'm now willing to tell this part of the story. I wrote about it in a paper that got published in July about the origins of MBSR, or at least some of them, because people make up like what they think it was. And since it came out of my life, I felt like a responsibility to at least say what it was, in my experience. And, so I was on about the 10th day of a 2-week meditation retreat at the Insight Meditation Society in Barrie, silent retreat, Vipassana tradition. And I was meditating in my room. And, after 10 years of what is my job on the planet with a capital J, I'd already been working at the UMass Medical Center for 3 years in a laboratory doing gene cloning and molecular biology and studying muscle development. And at a certain moment, I just had this flash, occurred for maybe 5 seconds, 10 seconds, and it was like I saw what I needed to do. I just saw it. I saw the stress reduction clinic. I saw because I was already at UMass, so I could do this there, and that I would just take all of these various practices that I'd already been training in for years, and make them available in a completely secular way, but that doesn't denature the Dharma essence, if that were possible to do, and make it available to the people who were, quote unquote, falling through the cracks of the healthcare system. And that was 1979 when there were cracks in the healthcare system. Now there's like chasms in the healthcare system. So people are like just, sort of raining down through the cracks in the healthcare system. And, and technology is not really the answer to our healthcare problem. I mean, it's partly the answer, but the real answer lies inside. We are self-regulating organisms, and we know how to heal. But we need to know something about this knowing and, as Socrates put it, not knowing. And so that's what this meditation training and practice is. And so I saw all that, and I saw that if it was successful at UMass, that it would spread around the world, that it would influence, science would come and everything else, and that we could try to seed that. And so in some sense that has come to pass. I mean, if you plot the number of papers with about mindfulness, if any of you've seen the latest plots, I mean, they just sort of low, threshold kind of for the 80s and 90s, late 90s start to go up, and now it's going exponential. And there's this thing, if you don't know about it, called the Mindfulness Research Monthly on the web, where every month it will download for you all of the papers coming out of mindfulness, nicely parsed by different categories, that a fellow named David Black is doing out of UCLA. Started in 2010, and it's just kind of mind-blowing. I don't even have time to read the titles of these things, no less all the abstracts, and it's like there is now a science of mindfulness, okay? And it's mindfulness writ large. It's not mindfulness the way the Tibetans define mindfulness. Part of my aim from the very beginning was to basically bring the Dharma into the mainstream, okay? So mindfulness is a placeholder in some ways for the entire Dharma. So it's not like, oh, John did a very nice thing with mindfulness, but he kind of left out compassion.
I was going to say that.
I don't think so. Although that doesn't mean there's not a huge amount of room for now, so exploring, well, what is compassion? What is mindfulness? How do these things work together? Is it true that, as they often say, they're like two wings of a bird? Okay, one bird, okay? So it's not like we just look at the left wing or the right wing. I mean, it's like two wings of a bird. I have come to see mindfulness as a kind of radical act of love, a radical act of sanity. Just to stop would be a radical act of sanity. And to learn or know how to drop in and in some sense befriend your experience as it is, without having to make it different, shape it, build a big story about how great a meditator you are, or how great and compassionate you are, or how much full you are of loving kindness, all of which is more narrative, more thinking. But to actually, in some sense, let the core inheritance that's already you by virtue of being human emerge in a way that's literally unstoppable.
You know, one of the reasons I was asking you the earlier question was not to put you on the spot, but I think everyone in this room, of course, has a story. And obviously for that person, it's an incredibly important story. And a lot of us, myself included, you know, especially early on, we get caught up in trying to define what it is we are, who we are, and what potential we have, or where our path goes. And I think by looking at people who have achieved extraordinary things, number one, oftentimes, as you pointed out, you didn't know how you got here necessarily, or it wasn't as if you sat down at age 19 and said, here's my trajectory and it's going to happen. It's a process, it's happenstance, it's opportunity, and then it grows. And I think the important part of this is that within everyone, you have that potential, and it lies there. And you have talked about, we set this up.
Thank you. Because that's it.
Yeah, so I think by having this narrative, especially with people who are quite accomplished, and oftentimes when we look at many of these people, we don't see ourselves among them. We somehow see ourselves here, and what they've done is here. But I think the point of this, and what I wanted to get at with this, was the fact that this lives in all of us. This potential is there. And it's having the understanding to see that it's there and being given the gift of a little bit of insight that can let this blossom. And I think that's...
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for saying it, because that is the whole point, and why I don't like to even tell the story, because it's never been about me. It's always been about we or us, and this is really where compassion does come in the sense that, you know, you take these people falling through the cracks of the healthcare system. So that means that they're hurting. And they've tried what's supposed to be like the best stuff, and it hasn't worked in their case. And they may feel either ignored or a failure or whatever it is, or hopeless. And so the idea was like, well, let's just put 30 of those people in a room, okay? We'll just put them in a room in the hospital with somebody who can hold the space in a certain way and be present, and invite them to see if there's not something that they can do for themselves that no one else on the planet could possibly do for them, as a complement to whatever their medical treatments would be, and see what the outcome of 8 weeks of training in that particular kind of what I call orthogonal rotation in consciousness, so that you're now actually, instead of thinking of yourself as the sort of victim, or in some sense the passive recipient of treatment, it just becomes a participatory medicine, and that you're recruiting and bringing to the fore all of your interior resources that you have for learning, for growing, for healing and transformation by virtue of being human. And everybody has them in sort of their own unique constellation, and nothing is more pleasurable than actually sitting in a room like that with people, and everybody knows they've already not been fixed, okay? So it's not like, oh, now Jon Kabat-Zinn's going to fix them. No, it's not about fixing. It's not about fixing. But it is very much about healing rather than curing. So I sort of define healing as, in some sense, coming to terms with things as they are, as opposed to curing, which would be, you know, sort of, yeah, just acceptance, acknowledgement, but not as in passive resignation, but as a place to begin, as a place to stand, and then to adventure, so to speak, in the field of the possible by owning the present moment as if your life depended on it. And I like to say often to people, and it does, in more ways than you think, and in more ways than you can think. And people are really happy to hear that kind of message, because It's a message of tremendous positivity, and it's not about they have to be like somebody else or get something from someplace else. So here we come to the sort of core issue, and that is how skillful can we be in developing programs that actually bring out these innate capacities that we have that are very often so highly conditioned out of us that we lose touch with our deepest sort of essence, so to speak. And then and the unhappiness and alienation that arises from that, and then in some sense come back to fully inhabiting the human repertoire. And awareness, to me, is the actual key piece, the actual key piece. And as soon as there's awareness, in my experience, in my view, there's awareness of relationality. Everything's relational because there's a certain way in which, like, being beings, there's a kind of the inside and the outside. Okay, so we can relate to our own bodies. Many people have a very negative story about their body, especially if they're a medical patient. And then you can relate to experience outwardly. And so relationality becomes key. And then the next thing, it's almost inevitable that you see, is that we're all part of the same larger unfolding. You experience, not think about, but you experience interconnectedness.
No, it's interesting. Obviously, as a physician myself and here at Stanford, there's a perception that we can fix everything with our technology, and we clearly can't. I mean, in my own experience, a large percentage of patients who come to me with spine disorders, oftentimes it's not the pathology that you see on the x-rays, and I always say we don't operate on x-rays, we operate on people. Fundamentally, there is a mind-body disconnect which is manifesting itself in their complaints, and the easy path for us to take, and unfortunately one that I think many doctors take, is the path to physically intervene on something that's not the origin of the problem. And the horrible thing for the people that you're describing who are in this room and who have been in many rooms and who have been through the system and have not been helped by the system is once they've seen 2 or 3 doctors and you start collecting paper. Once the paper gets to a certain thickness, no other doctor starts reading it and writes you off. Because if 2 or 3 other doctors haven't found it and a lot of testing has been done, they assume you have a problem and you're the problem. And this is an incredibly isolating event for a patient. And it's really so sad to see this. And this type of work has had extraordinary impacts on a large group of people who've been sort of shunted aside, disregarded. And, you know, as physicians, our ego structures is we want to get accolades because we've been so successful at treating patients. And when we have it in front of us, someone who's failed that, we don't want to see them because it reminds us of our own failures. And so we shuttle them away. And these people, again, and I know you've seen this as a large part of your career, I see it, unfortunately, in a lot of what I do, giving them tools that allow them to gain their self-respect, to believe that they do have the capacity to help themselves. And this transformative experience of getting the power to change yourself is life-changing.
You know, it's also true that it's very healing for the physician or the surgeon, because and we've seen this countless times when the patients go back to the doctors that referred them to the stress reduction clinic. There's a kind of looping of an educational shift, because the patients often come back looking different without having had neurosurgery or back surgery or even more drugs, but they look different. And the doctors will often notice, oh my God, you know, I've known you for 8 years. What's different? And the patient probably won't be able to say even, but what's different is that they're more embodied. They're more understanding that what they've got is workable, rather than an auto mechanic's view of medicine where you drive into the garage and get it replaced or fixed or whatever. That they've sort of owned the complexity of a human life and understand that not everything can be, the way it was 25 years ago, but that there is tremendous possibility and positivity, and not as a philosophy, but they've tasted it already in the 8 weeks. They've tasted it. And so to a degree, and I don't want to exaggerate the degree of it, they're embodied. And often, the physicians are just delighted and say, well, I'm going to send more patients or something like that. And often they send their own family members. And that was something that, was obvious pretty early on in the trajectory of MBSR. But I do want to say that, from the very beginning, the idea wasn't to have a nice therapy that we did at UMass. The idea was to actually transform the world. I mean, to shift the bell curve of the world, because if it's true in any way, shape, or form that compassion and mindfulness and heartfulness, if you will, are really the core of our humanity, then the fact that we've been ignoring it for so long, socially and politically and economically and in every other way, as well as psychologically, is in some sense criminal. It's a criminal, it's an omission, if not commission, and that if we can gather evidence through clinical medicine and through neuroscience and through all sorts of other avenues, that there is actually kind of an alternative way of understanding our humanity than what we've got so far. That's just fine, but it's just not full. It's not complete. It's not developed enough. Then we have the potential to actually bring this into the mainstream in a way that is like a public health intervention. We're talking about, I mentioned sanity before. Well, we could all use a dose of sanity and not be so driven by greed, hatred, and delusion. The classic toxins of the sort of Buddhist view. But, where would you find the sort of most interesting microcosm of greed, hatred, and delusion? Well, you don't have to look any further than the Congress. You know what I'm saying? I mean, it's like you've got this going where our whole political system is driven by greed, hatred, and delusion. And that might have been fine 100 years ago. I don't think it's fine anymore. I think that if we took a medical view of the body politic, let's just say America, and brought exactly the same kinds of things we've been talking about today to the whole of the body politic of the United States. I mean, it's obvious, like, you can't have the heart and the lungs go to war with each other and do very well. You can't have everybody suspicious of everybody else and not realizing that there's some kind of commonality here. It's patently insane. And you can't have all the resources be sort of siphoned off by, 0.1% of the cells getting everything, and then the other 99.9%. If you don't mind my digressing in this direction, I don't think it's even a digression. This is like as much about mindfulness as anything else. That if you misdiagnose the national problem, you're going to mistreat the national problem. We're seeing that in the newspaper day in and day out.
Well, I think you've made allusions in some of your books to this idea that in some ways some of these behaviors are a prison that people put themselves in. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the problems, of course, is you can't know you're in a prison. If you don't acknowledge you're in a prison, you can't get out of prison, right? And the difficulty, and maybe you can comment on this, is how do you get out? How do you make people recognize that they're living in a prison and that getting out of this prison, number one, they actually have the key, and number two, the value proposition of freedom. And
well, it's no accident that mindfulness is spoken of as the heart of Buddhist meditation, and it's all about wakefulness. It's all about waking up. It's all about liberation, about freedom. It's not just a metaphor. I mean, it's literally true. And so that's a very profound question. How do we, because it's not like, well, we've woken up and all the rest of these poor people are like, somnambulant. No, how do we individually and collectively wake up to the full spectrum of our humanity and our repertoire of resources and the richness of our interconnectedness, because we can't exist without each other. I mean, every single person on the planet, came out of, maybe with, infinitesimally small number of exceptions, came out of the body of a woman. I can't help turning towards you. I just became a grandfather for the first time 3 months ago. And it's like, I know all the biology, but still, it's like unbelievable how we develop. I mean, and how complex what is in our heads is in terms of just, structure. The complexity, like the most complex formation of matter in the known by us universe, right inside our heads. I mean, we're walking miraculous beings in so many different ways, and yet most of the time we're kind of depressed and feel badly about ourselves, and and no one's immune from it. But this is where that compassion comes in. This is where kindness towards ourselves comes in. This is where heartfulness and knowing ourselves in a way that's not about self-inflation, but it's about realizing our beauty and our potential to actually be of some use, And it seems to me that this is a very complex field. It's not like there's one answer. Oh, it's MBSR, or oh, it's compassion, or the Stanford training. Although, these things are really important catalysts, and we learn a lot from them. But one of the things that I've learned over the years is that while it's really important to have a program like MBSR and have fidelity to the curriculum to a degree, the actual value of it is very intimately associated with the degree to which the teacher has embodied this kind of understanding in his or her own life. Not to inflate it or make it seem like one's gotten anywhere, but in fact to be open enough and spacious enough to recognize the true nature, if you will, in every single human being, the beauty in every single human being, and then create a kind of holding environment or a kind of a context in which that is allowed to flower. Wouldn't that be nice if that happened in every kindergarten in the, in every school in the country? But even in hospitals, I mean, we have to start someplace, okay? So wherever it is, and we do it in schools now, we do it in businesses, we do it in hospitals, we do it in prisons, and the it is always basically the same thing. In all Asian languages, I'm told, East Asian languages, Asian languages, the word for mind and the word for heart, it's the same word. And Dr. Wei-Chi Tong and I just came back from 12 days of teaching in China, and Wei-Chi was my main translator for the entire time. I mean, this whole thing was done in Chinese. And the outpouring of connectivity and the interest in the fact that they have a 1,500-year history of Dharma that they virtually don't know anything about. But the potential for that, given what China's role is and is going to be in the next couple of 100 years, imagine the possibilities if we actually think bigger rather than just tiny. Okay, so that's what I meant when I said it was never about like group therapy or a nice little intervention or one-on-one with a patient, even if that patient benefited tremendously. I mean, there's a certain way in which I feel like the planet is in sorry need of all of our attending, so to speak, and it needs the unique imagination and capabilities of each of us, not 100 clones of somebody that we think is great, but for each one of us to actually be that in a way that no other person on the planet does it quite the way you do it.
I was just going to say, one of the things that's interesting is you see so much suffering in the world, and oftentimes you're overwhelmed by it. And one of the things that I try to always emphasize to myself, and I think is important, is that each of us has the ability to have a positive impact in the smallest way every day. And the cumulative effect of that can just be extraordinary. I wanted to ask you, I have run into some people, and I'm sure you probably have too, who take an aspect of the mindfulness to give them focus, to give them clarity in some particular area, but it almost gets distorted where it's a narcissistic self-absorption. Can you comment on that? Or would you say that's not true mindfulness?
Well, certainly not true mindfulness, but there are all sorts of potential pitfalls or misunderstandings along the way. It's really a developmental trajectory. It's really about befriending yourself. That's very different from narcissism. But if some people are intrinsically narcissistic, maybe they'll think that at first or get that at first. But over time, I think if you continue to cultivate mindfulness, you'll see that. I mean, that's the beauty of it, is that it's like the more you see, the more you see. And the more you allow yourself to feel, the more you actually feel. And the more you can inquire actually into who is seeing, who is feeling, who is hurting. And these are very, very fundamental ways in which we can discover what I like to speak of as kind of hidden dimensions of our own being. Okay, as you probably know from string theory and cosmology and so forth, the higher physicists now feel like we're living in at least an 11-dimensional universe. With a lot of the dimensions are like folded into time and space below the Planck constant level. Okay, so if they can talk about hidden dimensions, why can't we? I mean, that one dimension that's hidden to us is the present moment. Present moment, where's that? We're always someplace else. Okay, so just that would be a tremendous act of wisdom and compassion, just to, hey, hang out more here, or at least see how hard it is to hang out here more. And another one would be the sense that it's not a zero-sum game, that if you actually extend compassion to the other, you're the first beneficiary, so to speak. And that this is not a concept, again, or a philosophy, it's a practice. You work with your own, what you might call inadequacies or incompetencies or, highly conditioned traits that are very self-absorbed or narcissistic or whatever. And you realize, yeah, but is your awareness of your narcissism narcissistic? Is your awareness of the pain you experience actually suffering? Is your awareness of the anxiety that you might be feeling anxious? And in this way, you're starting to exercise muscles you didn't even know you had and learn to inhabit dimensions of your being that have been here all along, just kind of hidden, not so much in evidence, or you could say eradicated when we were little, because they didn't get any airtime, and we were all taught to think that we were supposed to be a certain way, and to a large extent we bought it, so to speak. I want to just sort of say one more thing about the sort of larger social sweep of this, because I really do see this as a kind of as much a political and an economic adventure as it is a psychological and neuroscience adventure and a medical adventure, because we're all in the same boat together. So just two things. One is, and maybe some of you know this, Jeffrey Sachs just came out with a book called The Price of Civilization. And he's a macroeconomist, I think at Harvard now, but worked with the USSR when it was collapsing, and with a lot of emerging economies in Africa and so forth. And he has just written a book called The Price of Civilization. And the whole point of the book is that what we need is more mindfulness. How he got to it, I'm not quite sure, but he's a very, very influential economist. And he's saying we need to actually bring back the full dimensionality of the human repertoire. And then he outlines it in some detail. The other thing is a book that will be coming out very shortly. So he has a chapter in there called The Mindful Society. I was like, wow, who knew? I mean, it's one thing when I say it, it's another thing when he says it. Then maybe you've heard of a congressman from Ohio named Tim Ryan. So Tim Ryan has gotten very involved in mindfulness from his own meditative perspective, and also seeing the potential of this in society. And he's coming out with a book in a couple of months called A Mindful Nation. Now, that's pretty amazing that a sitting 5-term young congressman would dare to write a book called The Mindful Nation and, take that kind of personal risk to be out there in some way or other. And I think it's, in some sense, a measure of his own integrity and, sort of conviction. And in another way, it's I think, contains a certain kind of promise that we are much better than we sometimes actually act like we are, as a species, as a country. And we need to start appealing not to our rhetoric of democracy or our rhetoric of how wonderful we are as Americans, and making the rest of the world safe for democracy, but we need to actually appeal to the original beauty, so to speak, or original mind or original heart. And that this is important because as a species, we're so precocious. I mean, we may be generating serious problems for the planet. I mean, you can take out the may if you like, that put every single, species, including every single one of us and many generations in the future, at risk. So from that point of view, the wake-up call isn't just for, say, the individual person who is suffering with this or that, but is really a wake-up call for all of us to realign ourselves or to experiment, to use the laboratory of our own experience to learn and grow and heal and transform. And I think it's going autocatalytic. I mean, that's my hope, is that, the more it happens, the more it happens, the more it happens. And what we need to do is make sure that it doesn't become a fad and we lose the true wisdom element of this, and the hard work of this. Is no joke to actually reclaim the full dimensionality of being human. I mean, because we're so into self-deception, we're just masters of self-deception. And the narcissism and the ego and all of that stuff, they're not just like, oh yeah, now I meditate, they're long gone. No, they're here. So we need to bring awareness to all of that in a very realistic way.
You commented on that mindfulness is one wing of the bird and compassion is the other. Could you comment on that and how you see that being integrated together, or because it seems as though on some level there's a focus on mindfulness and there's not as much conversation about compassion, yet it seems as though sort of you need both, and you need them almost in equal quantity to fly, if you want to use the same.
Well, from what I learned this morning about what your center is doing, I was very, very uplifted because, this is a trajectory. It's a learning trajectory, and we had to start somewhere. And so we started with mindfulness, and I think it was it was meant always to be a skillful means to introduce, as I said, the full spectrum of the Dharma in its most universal, sort of ways into the mainstream. So now we've got all of this interest in compassion. It would have been unthinkable 20 years ago or even 15 years ago. So a certain kind of ground, soil has been prepared, the fields have been plowed and so forth. And the questions that you're asking about it are unbelievably sophisticated. There wasn't even the technology to do it when I started the MBSR program. I mean, it didn't have the capacity to do the kinds of studies that you're thinking of and to relate it to neuroeconomic games and all sorts of amazing paradigms that could actually, clarify the nature of the heart and the nature of the mind, and at the same time develop training programs and cadres of people who really want to make a right livelihood and devote their lives to that kind of work, bringing compassion into the world. So I've never seen mindfulness and compassion as being different. It's just that I always felt that it was more skillful, in my case, to just embody the compassion and embody the loving kindness and train in the muscle of mindfulness / heartfulness, because you have to hear them that way, and then everything else unfolds naturally, and that's my experience in MBSR. Now, when we start to do studies that compare the Stanford Compassion program with MBSR, you may find that there are all sorts of differences between that kind of training and this kind of training. And I think that's absolutely wonderful. 100 years from now, we'll know even more, and probably neither of those programs will be like, what they are today, but there'll be, new generations of understanding and development will come out of it. And that's, as far as I'm concerned, as it should be, so that we're all, in some sense, in process and doing the best we can and fine-tuning our interventions so that they really touch people in the deepest of ways, and that we understand what their limitations are and develop new interventions to touch those people who are not so easily touched by one particular angle on things, so they need another particular angle on things. I was very moved to get a link by email the other day from David Kearney and Caroline McManus, who are MBSR teachers at Puget Sound, VA, and David's a gastroenterologist, and for years, and they're both mindfulness MBSR teachers, and they have a whole cadre of MBSR teachers there, including the woman who made the film, Lisa Hardmeyer, and you can get this, it's on the web, a half-hour program of not MBSR, but loving kindness that they did with the vets. And it is unbelievably moving. I mean, it looks a lot like MBSR, the context is a lot like MBSR, but much more loving kindness explicitly practiced and then discussed among the vets, men and women, and it's just, I thought, profoundly moving. And so there's a certain way in which its time has come, that there are measures of compassion now coming online. There are lots more compassion researchers than there were before. And probably, correct me if I'm wrong, that you can actually maybe have a career in neuroscience if you're interested in compassion now.
Say that too loudly, though, because
okay,
it's
it's like,
sort of
but you know what I'm saying. I mean, it seems to be going in that direction. That was not true even 5 years ago, is my guess. So it's certainly not.
It's interesting you say that, because since our center started, I'm sure we're not the only one, but the number of emails that I've received that said, boy, I'm so amazed this is happening at Stanford, and I've really wanted to study this area, but I was afraid to tell anyone because they would give me such a hard time and say it was not worthwhile, which isn't that extraordinary to think that when you're talking about compassion, relieving the suffering of another, that the exploration of that is considered not worthwhile by people?
Well, and partly, I guess it's because we have a certain kind of dualism about our own, and diffidence about our own intelligence, which is multiple. Okay, according to Howard Gardner and many people, we have multiple intelligences. But in certain kinds of intellectual frames, certain intelligences are favored and others are like not even recognized. And I think what's happening is that the university, which is like a beautiful, beautiful edifice, I'm not talking about the Stanford campus, I'm talking about the university from the first one in Italy, back in the day, in the Middle Ages, that there's something about the university that is very powerful good in society. But it also very often stops being universal and gets into little fiefdoms and silos and so forth. And what we're beginning to realize is that everything is interconnected with everything else. All good scientists know that, all good humanists know that, but then we tend to still stay in our little silo. But now we're developing capabilities to actually understand the sort of foundational elements of wisdom and compassion. And that requires getting out of the silos and actually developing new career pathways and new ways of being and teaching that are no less intellectually rigorous than anything that's come before, but also not blind or driven very often by the usual greed, hatred, and delusion that somehow have managed to, squirrel themselves into even universities to some degree.
Very true. On that note, actually, just a comment about the loving kindness training for the vets. We're actually doing a program here now, led by Yotam and Jim Hallenbeck, who are here with veterans with our Stanford Compassion training. And I think the same type of deep felt response to that type of connection especially, a lot of these people have suffered deeply from their experiences, and I think it really is extraordinary to see the impact. And, in those cases, it's really quite dramatic because these people are suffering at a deep level and they've been holding it in. But, for each of us every day, we have the capacity to also feel that. And I think that's really the extraordinary thing, is recognizing within each of us that capacity and that ability. I think we're going to close. I want to thank you so much for being our inaugural conversationalist on.
This is so sweet. Yeah, thank you.
We barely scratched the surface too. So there's a lot more work to be done. I just want to say thank you for the invitation and the incredible privilege of being here and also spending the morning with part of your team and really hearing sort of how amazing the things that you have afoot really are. And it's just I'm very happy for the world that this is a reality.
I would also like to acknowledge Pierre Omadar, who, through his generosity, has actually given us a grant to pursue our professional education program in compassion. So thank you. And thank you all.